Joined here with our GDP reaction panel. We've got Chris Richardson, partner at Deloitte Access Economics, joining us, our Political Editor Andrew Clennell and our Chief Anchor Kieran Gilbert. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. Now, Chris Richardson, what do you make of these early figures?
They are good numbers. Now, the Australian economy has been travelling slowly. That was evident through 2019. The unemployment rate edged up a little. Before the real impact of bushfires came just at the end of the period this covers, and the coronavirus, the Australian economy was starting to recover just a little. The government should be happy enough to see these numbers amid the challenges of the moment.
Absolutely, much better than we were all expecting. And the discussion today was around stimulus and what that might be looking like. It was definitely a different rhetoric from the government. Andrew, you have some more information on that?
I do, Annalise. I can reveal that it looks like the stimulus package being put together by the Morrison government is going to be worth billions, not hundreds of millions. It's going to have a B in front of it, and it's going to be in these areas: tourism, trade, industry, education, infrastructure and agriculture. In the next 24 to 48 hours, ministers have been tasked with putting together proposals to put to the Prime Minister to push through as part of a stimulus package to get over this coronavirus crisis. So better than expected numbers, as you say, but you know, we're still waiting for the March quarter and more fears about the March quarter and June quarter. Prime Minister Morrison's getting ahead of it here and activating his ministers to do this. Just one area, for example, where the government could act, it could remove export costs for business, and in doing so that would help them in a situation where they're unable to export in the way they generally have been able to. So we're going to have bushfire recovery stimulus, drought stimulus, and now coronavirus stimulus. The Prime Minister always said it would be targeted. He said it would be modest. He's changed that language to moderate. I believe it's going to be worth billions of dollars.
Kieran, that sounds an awful lot like the surplus is out the window. What do you think?
The surplus, I think, is very much gone. And just one further thing to add to what Andrew has with that extensive information is also, I'm told that this stimulus will be announced within a week, maximum 2 weeks. So we knew that it would be before the budget. Well, it's going to be well before the budget. It's going to be within the next fortnight that this is going to be announced.
Very interesting.
That's from a senior source within the government who's told me that, so it's within the next fortnight. The other thing that you mentioned as in terms of the surplus, I think this is really, you know, in political terms, it's secondary now, because we know how much governments of both persuasions have been talking up this great feat of our economy to have 2 decades plus of continuous growth. You don't want to be the government whose watch that trend, that run ends on. And so they want to avoid a recession. And while this is a short-term relief, as you say, quite rightly, Annalise, a sigh of relief, I think, around this place today with that number, it is only short-term because we know the March quarter is going to be negative and potentially substantially negative in terms of those numbers.
Absolutely, because that's when we're expecting the real impact of the bushfires to really start to hit the economy. What do you make of Andrew's details that he's revealed about what the stimulus would look like? Would that be enough to kickstart the economy? It
does need to be billions. So on our estimates, the coronavirus will cut out of national income $5.5 to $6 billion in the first half of 2020. Now, the Reserve Bank, with its decision yesterday, probably added back something like $1 billion. I would like to see the government add back another $2, $3, $4 billion. You don't need to make up the whole but you do need to do 2 things. Help those areas specifically hurt, and Andrew, your list said exactly that. And you need to give the nation some confidence that, you know, this is, you know, they can't stop the coronavirus reaching Australia, but they can limit the damage to the livelihoods and Kieran, to your point, to the jobs, you know, that risk around jobs for Australians.
Kieran, what do you think the next step is here for the government with the stimulus package? If we're waiting 2 weeks for those details, that's a lot of political leverage for Labor in the meantime, but also we are going to be seeing more detailed figures coming out of this is the overall headline line, but it's still not all going to be good news.
No, it's not, and as we said, it's short-term relief. I think where to next? What the government needs to do, Annalise, is use this crisis as a chance for reform. It's not just about a short-term stimulus. In fact, I probably wouldn't even use that word. They need to say and embrace this as a chance for proper reform, because really the government's been, swaying in the breeze from one issue to the next, being thumped from one to the next. They don't have something to rally behind. They need to rally behind some proper reform, as a Liberal government should argue for, and that includes boosting in business investment. They didn't get the business tax cut through. They need to boost business investment. And as Jennifer Westacott pointed out on Sky News yesterday, and has been arguing along with Innes Willox, I think a very compelling case, to boost that, they need to provide investment incentives. I think we will see that as part of this package. But they need to say that this is as a broader reform, and not to be shy about it, because the PM lost a lot of confidence through the fire crisis. He needs to use this crisis to get back on track.
Andrew, do you agree?
I think infrastructure spending in particular will be interesting, and how they go about that. We heard Michael McCormack saying, I'm writing to the states asking for their projects. Obviously, Kevin Rudd went down that path, Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan, with the school halls, and that was criticised at the time as being more costly than it should. The argument from Wayne Swan at the time was we needed something that was shovel-ready. So that will be the issue here. If they are to look forward to fast-track infrastructure funding and billions of it, are they going to have the capacity to do that with things that are shovel-ready, so they're coming on board in the next few months? That will be the real challenge, and it's often quite challenging. So I think infrastructure spending very important here. There's been a call on the government for a while to increase it. $100 billion over 10 years they've been flagging all the time. Well, the New South Wales government spends $100 billion on it in 4 years. So let's see what they can do on that front. And I think people would cop a deficit if they really made moves in that infrastructure area. But again, it's the shovel readiness that could be the concern here.
And beyond that, I'll float something as well, and I'd be interested to see what Chris Richardson thinks about this. If a lot of people have suggested around Scott Morrison and his political approach that at times he's modelled himself on John Howard. Well, if he really wants to do that, he has to be bold on reform, as Howard was certainly in 1998 with the GST approach. And this is, as I say, this is not a first-term government. This is a third-term government, and if they're going to actually make a difference, which I guess that's what they're there for, that's why people seek to be elected, have a crack at some proper reform. What about the consumption tax? I know Scott Morrison did a lot of work on that at the behest of Malcolm Turnbull before he pulled the rug out from under him. But that still makes sense to broaden the base, doesn't it?
And there are still a bunch of things that make sense on that reform agenda. And to your point, never waste a good crisis. It is worth, though, taking a moment to think about the size of the crisis. And it's uncertain. But on our estimates, at $5.5, $6 billion out of national income, and essentially a 6-month period of pain, that would rank it something like a third of the global financial crisis. And the global financial crisis was relatively mild in Australia. We're a $2 trillion economy. The government should be ready to do more over and above what it's preparing right now if it needs it. They've been using that word scalable, and I'm happy to hear it. The bigger this is, more infrastructure can play a role. And yes, they need to be doing more in general, and if they can piggyback some of the reform measures on the coronavirus response, well, all power to them.
What do you make of the argument that we've been hearing from Labor, and that they're saying we're heading this way because there's been consistent economic mismanagement, that the things like wages have been dragging down on the economy up until this point? Do today's figures counter that?
Well, today's figures say it was starting to ever so slightly get better. The pain for the Australian economy hasn't been the world economy. It's been a housing downturn and a really nasty drought. You can now add to that bushfires and coronavirus. The economy is only growing modestly, but it is much, much better than people think it is. ANZ Roy Morgan consumer confidence number out earlier this week. That survey's been around for decades. They asked people, well, how's the economy looking over the coming 12 months? The answer there was a record low. People are scared. And whether it's the Reserve Bank or the government, it needs not just to be the right measures, but it needs to be a calming. People are too scared right now, and governments need to do something about that.
Andrew, what do you make of this point, the lead up to the budget in particular, the idea that they're announcing the stimulus well in advance of the budget? Why do you think that's so significant?
Well, they just have to. I mean, you just can't wait that long. These are a crucial couple of months in the June quarter. You know, you risk the recession, and Kieran made a very good point before. You haven't seen a coalition government suffer a recession since the early 1980s. Scott Morrison, that's the last thing he wants to be known as a Prime Minister, whether a coronavirus is a factor or not. I think Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg will take a lot of pleasure out of these numbers, saying that it wasn't as bad in December quarter as most pundits sort of thought, and that they can stave off a recession. But that's why they're bringing it forward. They want something to happen now. They're not going to wait for May, that's for sure.
Because if they did wait until May, the political hit would be enormous.
Oh, absolutely. And this quarter is so crucial now. We're using the term stave off a recession. As Andrew pointed out, if you said that to me 6 months ago, I would have thought that's crazy, because everything else was still looking solid, as Chris Richardson pointed out. But that's the reality now. This is a government looking to stave off recession, and they need to move immediately, because the previous experience suggests that if there is a tax incentive, and Chris would know more about this than anyone, if there's a tax incentive that's delayed 12 months, well then what does business do? It delays its investment for 12 months, and that's the last thing this government can afford right now.
Yeah, no, we need better confidence. We need people out there spending. We need governments spending. And it's tricky amid the fear of the moment. There's only so much that the Reserve Bank can do, that the government can do. Reserve Bank's already acted, and you're right though on timing. The government does need to act. Best guess is that we won't have a recession, and the government's response will help there. But the risks are higher than they've been for a while.
It's absolutely fascinating. Remember last year we weren't even allowed to say the word recession. We had to call it the R word. It was just amazing times. But thank you for joining us, Andrew Clennell, our political editor, Kieran Gilbert, our chief anchor, and Chris Richardson from Deloitte Access Economics. Now, coming